Ah yes, the Rolex Daytona. A grail to some, an abomination to others. It's been over 2 years since I last made a dedicated video around the Rolex Daytona, and let's just say that a lot has changed. A watch that is now spoken about in hushed whispers, used as an example that highlights everything wrong with this hobby. A watch that is now more often compared against fakes, and is only ever seriously spoken about as top-grade investment material. For the 1% who are brave enough to wear this watch 10 meters outside of the door of their houses, they are branded as lunatics. Yes, this is the world we live in now, where the Daytona is bought, kept in its box, locked up in a safe, hidden away from the light of day. Begs the question then, and try not to laugh at this, do people even care what this watch looks like anymore? I mean, really? Do people even care if its diameter goes up in size, if the case changes, if the colors change? It's not like we can get them, and those who have them, the majority at least, don't even wear them. Do people even ask the simple question of, what kind of changes will Rolex make to the Daytona in the future? Let's re-evaluate this watch and look at how it is perceived today. It's in a different place to where it was 6 years ago. Yes, of course, when this watch initially was introduced, I'm talking about the ceramic bezel variant, everybody was speculating, and the interest in this watch pretty much skyrocketed from day one. As we have seen the gradual climb and progression over the last 2 years, these watches are becoming more and more unobtainable by the day. And this is the whole dichotomy when we're talking about why people are attracted to this item. The attractiveness wavers when these watches are appreciated not for their inherent value as manufactured works of art, well-designed watches, but rather as things to own simply because of speculation, its perceived value as an asset. It moves from something that represents creativity into being merely an object to put your money into. All that's ever spoken about with this watch today is how much it's worth, how much it costs, and how much money has been put into it. And for someone who truly loves this watch, for the watchmaking, for its design, for what it represents as a watch that represents the pinnacle of its brand, its creative endeavor, a cult status, an interesting following, a fashion focus, that person is being left out of the conversation. Is this the most desirable Rolex? I think the majority of us would say yes. Personally, I don't understand it. I mean, the sub-dials are in the wrong place, it's very highly polished, it's difficult to read. Many people won't tell you this. Telling the time and running the chronograph, good luck with that. And the reason for this displacement, well, it's partly down to the diameter of the watch, the polished surfaces, the spaces taken up by the text, and the small surface area occupied by the hands. It's desirable because everyone wants it, but from a practicality point of view, it's not the best. If you're getting a watch for the sake of it being a chronograph, there are far better watches out there for this purpose. Makers like Zenith, JLC, Breitling all have amazing offerings. And of course the sister brand Tudor with their latest releases. I believe these watches were created with an intention to take the attention away from Daytonas in general. Giving somebody an affordable chronograph that's waterproof with ties to Rolex as a brand, but also has a sense of practicality as a daily wearing piece, and a design that will definitely work on all occasions. So before even getting into designs and renders and talks around how this watch could change and evolve in the next few years, is change necessary? Is Rolex deliberately focusing on not changing this chronograph? At least until 2026, which will be the 10-year anniversary of the ceramic Daytona. What would this change do to older models? Would it make them inferior, or would it just work the opposite way, create further escalation in price? Not quell the 150+% that these watches are going for on the grey market over retail price? I kid you not. Could this evolution make the situation even worse for these watches? And is that the reason why the brand is holding back? What I've heard a couple of times before from some interesting sources is that as a brand, Rolex does not focus too much on the longevity of their products. They're not very interested in gradually evolving their watches. They just want to be sure that these products sell and that they remain relevant. And I've heard on more than one occasion that as a manufacturer, Rolex doesn't have a plan set in stone. A lot of what happens when it comes to developing these pieces, they're often on the fly, and these watches aren't made with any real risk in mind. With all of that out of the way, let's get to the current design of the watch and talk about its style compared to the current sports lineup that we see from the brand. Could we say that it is ever so slightly outdated compared to its companions like the GMT, Submariner, Yachtmaster, Skydweller? I'm saying this primarily when we look to the case and we look to the overall diameter of the watch. Does this watch line up with the current identity when we look at the entire sports line? 39mm next to watches in the same category that range between 41 and 44 millimeters, of course barring the Explorer 36 millimeter. The 39 millimeter size, if we look at it holistically, doesn't represent the professional side of the brand anymore. The other side of that coin then is we could say that this piece leans more heavily towards being the dress side of the brand, less focused on the outdoor activities, the exploration, the conquering of mountains, reaching the greatest heights or going down to the lowest depths. But then you ask the question, why does it have a ceramic bezel, and why does it have crown guards? Why does it have 100+ meters of water resistance? If the brand was to up the diameter of this watch to 41 millimeters, which I still, even through the naysaying, believe it's a possibility, it's likely. The pro is that this watch will have better legibility, it'll fit on a larger range of wrists, but the con is that it might become too large and less elegant. I propose something else then. The brand doesn't increase the diameter, but does widen the case. Bearing in mind, not increasing the height of the watch, but its width. Returning this form of the super case in a different way. With some of these renders that you're looking at, you might think that it's just a typical model, that nothing's changed. But I have in fact widened the lugs on all corners and also adjusted the crown and the crown guard size. This change is barely noticeable, and that's all down to how this case was originally designed. The concept that has always existed, allowing for these lugs to taper, where there is greater wrist presence but the form still remains elegant. And there is something about this approach that I really like. They could go to the extent of widening the bracelet to 21 millimeters like many of the other watches in the lineup, but still keeping the diameter a nominal 40 millimeters. Will this improve in the watch's legibility? Not really. Could this be their subtle way of introducing a new movement? Possibly a new bracelet option, this watch now featuring a Jubilee. These are all possibilities I think we should consider. The next thing to talk about, which is also a hotly debated topic, is the amount of type on the dial. Many are asking for less type, and in this one situation Rolex has backed themselves into a corner. I say that because every detail on the dial, every line of text is relevant to how we see their current lineup today. Rolex Oyster Perpetual Superlative Chronometer officially certified. Those 4 lines are a part of every single watch this brand makes. The Daytona was originally called the Cosmograph, and that name has now stuck. And that in theory is the only line of text that they could get rid of, but would they do it? No. And of course the Daytona name cannot be touched either. So as much as we like the idea of a streamlined form with only 2 or 3 lines of text, I'm sad to say, judging by the track record, that's probably never going to happen. And then it's all about colors. Will they keep the monochromatic arrangement, or will they start playing around with things like black and blue? I do like the idea of a simple navy bezel insert. And we notice time and time again that blue and green are the core drivers belonging to the Rolex brand, especially the steel sports models. We've seen how these colors have now been implemented when we look to the precious metal variants too. Of course, one of the first in this category being the ice blue platinum variant with the brown bezel. It is one of the prettiest watches they've ever made. So with some of these renders, you've seen variances, you've seen change of bracelets, you've seen the addition of solid sub-dials, which I think would greatly aid in the watch's legibility, not only from a functional point of view when you're using the chronograph, but also to tell the time. And of course, one of the biggest gripes that many of us have is that the calibers that Rolex use with these pieces don't allow for the sub-dials to line up perfectly with the quarter batons. You notice the 3 and 9 sub-dials are raised above the 3 and 9 plots on the dial. This is all part thanks to a spatial issue, the fact that you can't cram so much detail into such a small dial. And this can be seen as an accommodation and not a direct design decision. Something, by the way, that could be greatly improved if the watch was increased by 1 or 2 millimeters. If we ignore all the hype, if we ignore the fact that these watches are very difficult to get as it is, Rolex doesn't need to make any changes to these watches because they will sell either way. Are people even interested in these watches and their designs anymore? I don't know. With all of that aside, we look to the design of this watch and where it could improve. Increasing the diameter by a few millimeters will make it more legible, will give it more presence on the wrist, making its function a lot better for people. This could give the brand the opportunity of adjusting the aesthetic of the dial, making the sub-dials more balanced, centered. It has the potential of allowing them to bring in a new movement. And of course, integrate them with new colors, making them more lively, more interesting. Only possibly changing colors of dials, not necessarily bezels. To say that the Daytona as a watch is a mixed bag is an understatement. I, like many of you, don't necessarily understand the appeal of these watches or why everyone wants them so badly. 6 years ago, when I had the opportunity of being able to try this watch on at an authorized dealer, I was underwhelmed. It's good in a way that this watch is not a universal people pleaser, especially next to something like the Submariner, which is ubiquitous. And the last parting question I will leave for all of you is it even likely that Rolex as a brand will ever need to adjust this watch in the future years? Are they worried as a brand that this change will cause an even greater stir, an even greater fissure between those who want the watch to wear it and those who wanted to sell it? Sadly then, the Rolex Daytona has become a victim of its own success. The brand doesn't know what to do with it. The watch has such a highly perceived market value that it's bordering on lunacy. And there is simply no end to this interest in sight. But what do I know? I'm just a simple designer. And I perceive the value of it by how well it has been made, how well it has been designed, and not by the way that other people value it.